Romans threw dinner parties so wild that guests sometimes left wearing nothing but shame and olive oil. One emperor allegedly declared himself a living god, then hosted orgies to prove it. Hey friends, welcome to ancient Rome, the empire that conquered half the world and still couldn't conquer its own desires. Here, senators preached virtue by day and paid for sin by night. A goddess of love had her own taxes, and a temple guard could die for breaking his vow of chastity. Pleasure wasn't rebellion, it was religion. So before we begin, like and subscribe, but only if you're ready to uncover the forbidden, the hilarious, and the deeply human side of history. Now grab your wine, find a marble couch, and step with me into the city where power wore a toga and nothing underneath it. To understand the sexual culture of ancient Rome is to enter a civilization where intimacy was never private. Sex was politics, morality was performance, and the body, male or female, free or enslaved, existed within a hierarchy that reflected Rome itself. Far from the modern sense of mutual affection or romantic love, Roman sexuality was structured around status. Who penetrated and who was penetrated mattered more than the act itself. It was a language of dominance and submission, mirroring the Republic's social order and the empire's unyielding sense of control. Roman moralists such as Cicero and Seneca wrote of virtues, manly virtue, as the defining trait of Roman identity. To possess virtues meant not only courage in war, but mastery over one's passions. Yet paradoxically, the same society that praised self-restraint also tolerated vast indulgence among its elite, provided it did not threaten public order. What mattered was not chastity, but power. The ideal Roman male was expected to dominate. In politics, in war, and in bed, his masculinity was affirmed by his control over others, whether women, slaves, or even young men of lower social standing. In contrast, to be penetrated, physically or metaphorically, was to be subordinated. The Roman moral lexicon reserved contempt for synedi, men who took the passive role, not because of the act of sex itself, but because of what it signified: weakness, effeminacy, and a loss of dignity. As the poet Juvenal scathingly remarked, Rome, long mistress of nations, now lies beneath her own vices. His satire spoke less to prudish disgust than to a fear that indulgence had inverted the natural hierarchy upon which Roman identity was built. Sex, then, was not an equal exchange, but a social transaction. Enslaved bodies were considered property. Their use, including sexual use, required no consent. The Roman jurist Ulpian wrote matter-of-factly that the sexual availability of slaves was part of their master's dominium, or ownership. Female slaves were often forced to serve as concubines, while male slaves could be coerced into relations that reaffirmed their subjugation. Even freedmen, those once enslaved, carried the stigma of this imbalance. Their former masters could still claim ius osculi, the right to a kiss, a lingering reminder of who once held authority over them. The Romans codified these hierarchies through law. The Lex Scantinia, passed in the 2nd century BCE, penalized certain homosexual acts, but only when a freeborn Roman male was placed in the submissive position. The law protected status, not morality. Likewise, adultery laws under Augustus' moral reforms were less about fidelity than about preserving lineage and social order. A man could freely visit prostitutes, concubines, or slaves, but a woman's infidelity was a political crime, a threat to the purity of inheritance and the authority of the household. Roman households themselves were microcosms of empire. The paterfamilias, legally omnipotent, ruled his domain with the same absolute power as the emperor ruled Rome. He could arrange marriages, divorce his wife, or even execute a disobedient child. Within that system, sexuality was governance. A wife's chastity symbolized her husband's honor, just as the discipline of soldiers symbolized the virtue of the state. The philosopher Seneca described marriage as a partnership in all things, divine and human. Yet in practice it often served political ends, binding families, consolidating wealth, and producing legitimate heirs. This web of power produced a society both prudish and permissive. Public decorum was prized, yet erotic imagery adorned villas, bathhouses, and even household shrines. The frescoes of Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by the ash of Vesuvius, depict scenes of sexual play, not as scandal, but as decoration, part of life's vitality. For Romans, pudor, shame, was situational, not absolute. To be seen naked in the baths was no disgrace, but to be thought submissive or uncontrolled was a moral failing. Their obsession with appearances was moral theatre, chastity in the forum, license in the triclinium. Underlying it all was the Roman conviction that passion, if unchecked, could unravel civilization. Philosophers of the Stoic school, popular among the elite, warned against lust's irrational power. Musonius Rufus, a Stoic teacher of the 1st century CE, advised moderation in sexual life, declaring that desire should serve reproduction, not pleasure. Yet even he acknowledged the futility of total restraint. A society built on conquest could hardly deny the pleasures of domination. In literature, this duality appears everywhere. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, taught seduction as a social skill, a game played with intelligence rather than passion. His guide to courtship scandalized Augustus's moral regime and led to his exile in 8 CE. But Ovid's verses reveal a truth the laws could not suppress. For all their moralizing, Romans were fascinated by transgression. The forbidden was not erased. It was ritualized, aestheticized, made part of the spectacle of life. The historian Tacitus, ever the moral pessimist, lamented that the empire's expansion had corrupted old virtues. In his annals, he described the city as a sewer of nations, where luxury and lust dissolved discipline. But his bitterness reveals nostalgia for a republic that perhaps never truly existed, an imagined age of simplicity before wealth and empire made vice visible. The Romans projected their anxieties onto the bedroom, as they did onto the battlefield. Every private act reflected public decay or virtue. And so, in the Roman world, sexual practice was never simply private indulgence. It was language, a performance of dominance, hierarchy, and control. To trace its contours is to see how the Romans understood themselves as conquerors, rulers, and keepers of order, even in the realm of desire. Their empire was built not only on legions and law, but on a moral code that turned the human body into a symbol of authority. To them, pleasure without control was chaos, and chaos was the one thing Rome could never tolerate. To the Romans, the gods were not distant beings of moral perfection. They were mirrors of human nature, divine but flawed, glorious yet impulsive. Jupiter himself, king of the gods, was a serial seducer. Venus embodied love and lust alike. Mars was passion incarnate, his violence inseparable from desire. In this way, the Roman pantheon created a world where sexuality was not merely tolerated, but sanctified. Desire was not shameful. It was divine energy, a vital force that animated both the cosmos and the city of Rome itself. From the earliest days of the Republic, Roman religion functioned less as faith and more as ritual, a transaction between mortals and gods known as do ut des, I give so that you may give. Within that economy of divine exchange, fertility rites, sexual symbolism, and ritualized transgressions played a central role. These were not hidden acts of debauchery. They were public affirmations of life continuity. The boundaries between sacred and profane, spiritual and sensual, were fluid. A Roman farmer who prayed for a good harvest might also invoke Priapus, the rustic god of fertility, whose grotesque wooden statue stood in gardens, eternally erect and grinning, a reminder that fertility and virility were one and the same. The cult of Priapus, imported from the Greek world, exemplified Rome's peculiar comfort with sexual imagery. His images guarded orchards and vineyards, protecting them from thieves and birds with threats both comic and obscene. Priapus was not worshipped in majestic temples, but in the open air, among vines and fig trees, where sexuality merged with the soil itself. His poetry, collected in the Priapus, overflowed with bawdy humor, mocking, threatening, and celebrating the power of the generative organ as both weapon and charm. For the Romans, this was not vulgarity, it was the language of nature. The goddess Venus, meanwhile, occupied the pinnacle of Roman erotic devotion. Originally a fertility spirit of gardens and crops, she evolved into the embodiment of love, beauty, and sexual allure. By the late Republic, Venus had become inseparable from politics and empire. Julius Caesar, claiming descent from her through his ancestor Aeneas, built the Temple of Venus Genitrix in 46 BCE, merging divine sexuality with dynastic legitimacy. To worship Venus was to honor the lineage of Rome itself. Her power was both generative and seductive, a reminder that political creation, like biological creation, required union and risk. The blending of eroticism and religion was not limited to domestic cults. Foreign gods, imported through conquest, brought with them new rituals that scandalized and fascinated the Roman elite. None were more controversial than the Bacchanalia, the ecstatic rites of Bacchus, the Roman name for Dionysus. These mystery cults promise spiritual liberation through intoxication, music, and frenzied dance. Ancient accounts, especially the historian Livy, describe these gatherings as chaotic, nocturnal orgies where moral restraint dissolved and gender boundaries blurred. Livy, writing in the 1st century BCE, claimed that participants mixed together in the darkness and committed every kind of crime. His account, though exaggerated, reveals deep Roman anxiety. That unrestrained passion threatened not just morality, but social order. The Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus of 186 BCE outlawed the Bacchanalia across Italy, marking one of the earliest examples of the state policing private worship. Yet even as Rome suppressed Bacchic rituals, other ecstatic cults, such as those of Cybele and Isis, continued to flourish. The Great Mother Cybele, an Anatolian goddess of fertility and chaos, was introduced to Rome during the Second Punic War in 204 BCE. Her worship involved frenzied drumming, cymbals, and self-mutilation by her priests, the Galli, who castrated themselves in imitation of the god Attis. To the conservative Roman elite, this was deeply unsettling. Men renouncing masculinity in service to a foreign goddess of wild fertility. Yet her temple on the Palatine Hill became one of the most important in Rome, and her festival, the Megalesia, an annual event of music, parades, and divine celebration. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, added yet another layer to Rome's spiritual sensuality. Isis, the divine mother and protector, promised salvation and personal rebirth. Her rituals involved secret initiations, perfumed lamps, rhythmic chants, and processions of worshippers clad in linen robes. Though morally condemned by some Roman writers as effeminate superstition, her following spread among women, slaves, and even soldiers. In the frescoes of Pompeii, Isis temples are depicted with elegance and reverence, suggesting that, far from being scandalous, her worship offered emotional intimacy in a society bound by rigid hierarchies. The sensuality of her rites was spiritual, not sexual. Yet to the Roman mind, the two were never entirely separate. Even Rome's own festivals carried erotic undertones. The Lupercalia, celebrated in mid-February, combined fertility, purification, and laughter. Young men, stripped nearly naked and anointed with sacrificial blood, ran through the streets, striking women with strips of goat hide, a gesture believed to promote fertility. Far from being scandalous, it was considered an act of civic renewal. Centuries later, when Christian writers condemned such pagan revelry, they would transform its imagery into a warning against lust disguised as ritual. But in Rome prime, this mingling of body and belief was simply the rhythm of the world. In every aspect of Roman religion, the erotic was a metaphor for creation. The union of Jupiter and Juno represented cosmic order. The myth of Venus and Mars symbolized harmony between love and war. Even temple architecture carried sexual symbolism, columns as phallic emblems, domes as wombs of divinity. The Romans understood fertility as divine continuity. The city prosperity mirrored the fecundity of its gods and citizens alike. To ensure the crops grew, the herds multiplied, and the republic endured, they performed rituals that bound sensuality to survival. Yet this comfort with sacred sexuality began to wane as Rome absorbed more Eastern religions and moral philosophies. The Stoics, ever suspicious of excess, regarded these rituals as superstitious indulgence. Later, under the Empire, moral legislation under Augustus sought to domesticate passion, restricting festivals, regulating marriage, and casting suspicion on foreign rites. But even as the state attempted to rationalize faith, the old gods persisted in secret corners, in household shrines, and in whispered prayers. Rome could legislate against ecstasy, but it could not erase the human hunger to feel divinity through the senses. In the end, the Romans did not see sexuality and piety as opposites, but as partners in the eternal dance of creation and decay. Their rituals remind us that for all their power and order, they understood something elemental, that the divine, to be felt, must also be embodied. Their temples stood as monuments to this truth, stone expressions of flesh, sanctuaries where mortals touched the gods not just with their minds, but with their very being. The banquet was not merely a meal, it was a theater of power, a stage on which appetite, luxury, and hierarchy were displayed for all to see. To eat, drink, and recline in the company of others was to participate in one of Rome's most enduring rituals of dominance. The elite turned their dining rooms into microcosms of empire, spaces where the abundance of food and the orchestration of pleasure reflected their ability to command not only armies, but desire itself. The convivium, or banquet, was the centerpiece of elite social life. Reclining on couches arranged around a low table, the guests dined in strict order of rank. The host, or dominus, presided as master of both space and appetite. Every gesture, from the serving of imported delicacies to the playing of lyres and the recitation of poetry, was a demonstration of refinement and control. The quality of one feast signaled both wealth and moral character. Too little luxury suggested stinginess, too much implied decadence. As the philosopher Seneca observed with quiet disdain, "They vomit so that they may eat, and eat so that they may vomit." Yet even his moral outrage betrays fascination with the spectacle. The Roman banquet was a public mirror of private vice. Food itself became eroticized. Dishes like oysters, truffles, and honeyed wine were thought to stimulate desire. Bacchus, the famous Roman gourmand, composed recipes that fused indulgence with sensuality: flamingo tongues, dormice rolled in poppy seed honey, sow's udders stuffed with sea urchins. To dine extravagantly was to flirt with the divine. Luxury was both dangerous and seductive. The poet Horace mocked such indulgence in his satires, yet even he admitted the allure of sweet excess. The Roman table, glistening with silver and perfumed with exotic spices, became a sight where appetite blurred into art. But dining was only the beginning. As the evening progressed, conversation turned to philosophy, poetry, and occasionally politics, but also to laughter, wine, and play. The Roman writer Petronius, in his Satyricon, immortalized this world in his depiction of Trimalchio feast, a grotesque yet vivid portrait of nouveau riche luxury. Trimalchio, a freedman who flaunts his wealth with tasteless grandeur, stages an endless dinner of spectacle: roasted pigs stuffed with sausages, mechanical birds that pour wine, and dancers performing in grotesque imitation of myth. The satire was moral commentary, but it was also reportage. These excesses were not entirely fictional. The real Roman elite, from the Julii to the Flavii, used their feasts to assert control over pleasure itself. Orgies, though often exaggerated by later historians and Christian moralists, were less about unrestrained chaos than about structured ritual. The Romans used the term convivium nocturnum, night banquet, to describe gatherings that mixed wine, performance, and sexual license. These events, held by the wealthiest patricians, were invitations to participate in what might be called competitive indulgence. The host goal was to impress through abundance, not scandal. Erotic performance, often by slaves or actors, was part of the entertainment, a reflection of Rome's commodification of both pleasure and personhood. Still, there were moments when indulgence tipped into infamy. The historian Tacitus, ever the chronicler of moral decay, described how Emperor Tiberius, in his later years on Capri, surrounded himself with pupils in lust, turning the island into a private theatre of perversion. Suetonius, writing a generation later, embellished the story with grotesque detail, claiming that the emperor trained young boys to swim between his legs like fish, a clear moral allegory for tyranny unrestrained. Whether true or not, these tales served a purpose: to equate moral disorder in the bedroom with political disorder in the state. In the Roman imagination, the feast gone wrong mirrored the empire in decline. The link between indulgence and political commentary was so strong that emperors learned to use pleasure as propaganda. Nero, whose banquets were legendary, turned luxury into imperial theatre. His Domus Aurea, the Golden House, featured dining rooms with rotating ceilings that rained petals and perfume on guests. He transformed the act of dining into a performance of divinity, reclining as if Jupiter himself presided over Olympus. Suetonius tells us that at one banquet, the ceiling collapsed from the weight of its own decorations, a fitting metaphor for Nero's reign, beauty collapsing under excess. Banquets also served as arenas for gendered performance. Roman women of high status, though expected to embody modesty, were often central to the spectacle. Empresses like Messalina and Poppaea Sabina became symbols, sometimes of virtue, more often of scandal. Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, was accused by later historians of competing with prostitutes in contests of endurance. Whether myth or propaganda, the story reveals Rome's anxiety about women who wielded power through desire. A woman body, when public, was seen as a political threat. Even so, aristocratic women attended feasts, played music, and engaged in sophisticated repartee, asserting social influence under the guise of civility. Beneath the grandeur lay exploitation. Slaves served as waiters, entertainers, and sometimes unwilling participants in their masters' pleasures. Their silence was part of the spectacle. Pliny the Younger describes how wealthy hosts trained their servants to move unseen and unheard, as if their very existence were an extension of the dining furniture. Yet the presence of these enslaved bodies was essential. They were living symbols of the host dominion. In Rome, pleasure was never private. It was always performed for an audience of subordinates. To understand why such decadence fascinated the Romans, one must look beyond the moralizing of their historians. These spectacles were not acts of mindless hedonism. They were assertions of control in a world obsessed with fate. The empire stretched across continents, yet life remained fragile. Plague, war, and famine haunted even the wealthy. To eat lavishly, to laugh at excess, to surround oneself with abundance was to defy mortality. As Petronius put it, "Let us live while we may, for tomorrow we are shadows." Later generations would interpret this culture as moral collapse, the decline and fall before the fall. But in truth, Roman indulgence was not the symptom of decadence. It was the logic of empire. A civilization that conquered the world could not be expected to eat simply. The feast became a metaphor for conquest itself. Every glass of Falernian wine was a token of dominion. To dine in Rome was to taste the world. As night deepened and lamps flickered over marble floors, the line between ritual and release blurred. Music played, cups refilled, laughter mingled with whispers. Outside, the city roared with life, chariots rattling down stone streets, vendors calling, fountains singing their endless hymn. Inside the triclinium, power and pleasure became one. The feast was over, but its message endured. In Rome, even desire bowed to hierarchy. The empire of flesh was, above all, an empire of control. Nowhere was the Roman obsession with power and morality more visible than in the emperor bedchamber. For the ruler of the known world, sex was never private. It was an extension of imperial authority. Every rumor, every scandal, every whispered tale of indulgence became political currency. To rule Rome was to embody the empire itself, and the body of the emperor, his appetites, his control, his excesses, became a metaphor for the state. The imperial bedroom was both throne and stage, and what happened there would define entire dynasties. The early emperors understood that sexual reputation could make or destroy a reign. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, rose to power amid accusations of moral decay in the late Republic. Determined to restore dignity, he launched a campaign of public virtue. He promoted strict family values through his Lex Julia laws, criminalizing adultery and rewarding marriage and childbirth. But even Augustus could not escape the irony of control. While he posed as the guardian of chastity, gossip swirled about his own affairs. The historian Suetonius records accusations that he seduced senators' wives for political leverage. Whether true or not, such rumors reflected Rome's conviction that political power and sexual domination were inseparable. An emperor who ruled the bedroom ruled the world. If Augustus embodied restraint, his successors often represented its collapse. Tiberius, who followed him, retreated into secrecy and infamy. According to Suetonius and Tacitus, he withdrew to the island of Capri, surrounding himself with youths, astrologers, and entertainers. Suetonius describes lurid scenes of minnows trained to swim between the emperor's legs, and feasts where perversion replaced politics. Yet historians now read these accounts cautiously. Suetonius wrote under the emperors who followed, when tarnishing Tiberius' image served a moral lesson. The truth likely lies between slander and reality. Tiberius, a stern military man turned recluse, represented to Rome the danger of secrecy. When the emperor hid, imagination filled the void. His bedroom became a symbol of tyranny, private face. With Caligula, the imperial bedchamber became pure theatre. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, nicknamed Caligula or Little Boots, ascended to the throne in 37 CE as the adored son of a hero. Within months, he transformed adoration into horror. Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe him declaring himself a living god, marrying his sisters and turning the palace into a stage for blasphemous games. Whether he truly engaged in incest or used the rumor to provoke outrage is uncertain. But his manipulation of scandal was deliberate. Caligula blurred the line between divine and human, public and private, to display absolute power. When he paraded his sister Drusilla as Venus incarnate. It was less an act of lust than of symbolism, Rome itself made submissive under the body of its emperor. The Senate, accustomed to decorum, saw in his conduct the reflection of their own subjugation. Every excess was political commentary. His banquets, his staged weddings, his mockery of morality, all said the same thing, that Rome old virtues were illusions and that the emperor will was the only law. Caligula's reign ended fittingly in assassination, murdered by his own guards after 4 years of spectacle. But his legacy lingered. In Roman memory, he became the archetype of unbridled power cloaked in madness, the ruler whose bedchamber devoured the Republic's last illusions. After Caligula, imperial sexuality became a tool of governance and propaganda. Claudius, his uncle and successor, was mocked for his passivity and his wife infamous affairs. His consort Messalina became the embodiment of female excess in Roman law. Tacitus and Juvenal claimed she snuck from the palace at night to compete with prostitutes, satisfying hundreds of men before dawn. Such stories, though certainly exaggerated, reveal deep Roman fears about gender and authority. An emperor virtue was measured through his wife Chastity. Messalina mythic lust symbolized not just personal vice, but the fragility of patriarchal control. Her eventual execution for treason was both moral theatre and political necessity. Then came Nero, whose reign fused art, cruelty, and erotic display into one operatic vision of power. As Suetonius and Tacitus record, Nero staged his own marriages to men and women alike, dressed as a bride, and turned the imperial palace into a stage for orgiastic feasts. His infamous Domus Aurea, Golden House, was less a home than a declaration of divinity. Its rotating ceiling showered guests with petals as Nero sang of gods and heroes. In his excess, he sought to transcend humanity itself. His marriages to the boy Sporus, whom he allegedly castrated and wed, and to the noblewoman Poppaea Sabina, whom he killed in a fit of rage, symbolized both omnipotence and fragility. For Rome moralists, Nero's sexual fluidity was not just depravity, it was cosmic disorder, proof that the world itself had fallen from harmony. By the 2nd century, tales of imperial debauchery had become moral allegory. The emperors of the Severan dynasty, particularly Elagabalus, reigned 2–18–222 CE, revived this tradition with almost theatrical intensity. A teenager from Syria, Elagabalus shocked Rome with his devotion to the sun god Elagabal, whose worship included ecstatic dances and rituals foreign to Roman sensibilities. According to Cassius Dio, the young emperor married a Vestal virgin, a sacred woman sworn to chastity, a deliberate insult to Rome's religious core. He also reportedly held feasts in which guests were served food of a single color, released snakes into the crowd for amusement, and invited men to compete for his hand. Dio describes him dressing in women clothing and seeking a physician to give him the organs of a woman. Whether these accounts are historical fact or moral caricature, they reveal how Romans equated the disruption of sexual order with the collapse of imperial legitimacy. It is crucial to see beyond the moral outrage. The sexual politics of emperors were narratives written by their enemies and successors. When an emperor was loved, his indulgence was called charm. When he was hated, it was called vice. Caligula mock marriages and Elagabalus gender transgressions shocked not because they were unprecedented, but because they inverted the Roman hierarchy of dominance and restraint. To be penetrated, to relinquish control, was to reject the essence of virtues. Thus, sexual scandal became a political language. Every whisper about the imperial bedchamber carried meaning: who ruled whom, who submitted, and what that meant for Rome itself. Even emperors who sought moral reform could not escape this dynamic. The philosopher king lived in apparent moderation. yet his son Commodus revived the pattern of excess. Commodus saw himself as Hercules reborn, parading through the city in lion skins, wielding a club and demanding divine honors. His supposed orgies, though perhaps exaggerated, reinforced his theatrical self-image, the god made flesh, the conqueror who consumed as he pleased. When he was assassinated in 192 CE, senators declared his memory accursed, a ritual purification of Rome from its own reflection. By the time the empire began to decline, sexual scandal had become an expected symptom of tyranny. The private life of the emperor was public property. His desires were national symbols. In condemning them, Roman historians sought to defend an imagined past of virtue, even as they acknowledged that power itself corrupted restraint. The imperial bedchamber was no longer a place of sleep. It was the empire in miniature, where dominance, fear, and pleasure intertwined. To study it is to understand Rome's greatest paradox. A civilization obsessed with order that could not resist worshipping chaos in its most human form. The Roman Empire was built on ownership of land, of labor, of people. To be Roman was to command, to possess, to exercise dominion, dominium. Nowhere was this dominion more visible or more intimate than in the institution of slavery. Enslaved men and women were the invisible scaffolding of Roman civilization. They worked the fields, managed the homes, taught the children, and attended their masters at table and in bed. To own another person was to hold both their body and their silence. And this absolute control shaped every corner of Roman sexuality. Roman slavery was not based on race, but on power. Prisoners of war, debtors, and even abandoned infants could become property, their humanity dissolved into the marketplace. The jurist Ulpian defined a slave simply as instrumentum vocale, a speaking tool. Roman law recognized no concept of consent for enslaved persons. They were extensions of their master's will. Within this framework, sexual access was assumed. A slave body existed to serve the household needs, whether agricultural, domestic, or erotic. The philosopher Seneca, himself a wealthy man, once remarked that a slave is not a man, but a possession. He intended this as social commentary, but it revealed the moral foundation of Roman order. Hierarchy justified everything. In the domus, the Roman household, this hierarchy was visible in every room. The master, dominus, held legal power over all within his walls, wife, children, freedmen, and slaves alike. The paterfamilias was judge, priest, and executioner. Slaves attended their owners in the baths, dressed and undressed them, and shared their most private spaces. Sexual use was an accepted right of ownership, not a moral question. Roman law offered only one prohibition: the contubernium, or informal union, between a master and slave could not be recognized as marriage, since marriage required legal equality. Even affection was property. If a master freed a slave and later married her, the union carried the memory of ownership, a tension immortalized in the epigrams of Martial, who teased a friend for marrying his former concubine. You call her wife, but Rome remembers she was your slave. For enslaved women, sexual servitude was part of daily life. Many were purchased for beauty, trained as ancillae, personal attendants, or as entertainers and concubines. In large villas, slave women were categorized by function. Some tended the kitchen, others the loom, and others the master pleasure. Their offspring inherited the mother status, ensuring that exploitation replenished the system itself. Even children born of rape could be sold, a cruel arithmetic of profit and possession. The historian Plutarch notes that Roman matrons sometimes tolerated these affairs, knowing the law favored the husband rights over the slave suffering. Virtue in this society was defined by restraint only where status demanded it. For enslaved men, the situation was equally complex and often brutal. Roman masculinity depended on dominance. To be penetrated, sexually or symbolically, was to be dishonored. Yet slaves, deprived of legal identity, had no protection from this stigma. Masters might use male slaves as sexual objects, while still mocking passivity in others. The satirist Juvenal wrote venomously about soft men who submitted, yet his verses assume that domination of slaves was normal. The philosopher Musonius Rufus condemned such behavior as contrary to nature, but he was an exception. The majority saw it as part of dominium, the right to command every use of one property. Within this framework, even affection was political. The Roman playwright Terence, himself of North African descent and once enslaved, dramatized relationships between masters and enslaved women that oscillated between tenderness and coercion. His comedies, performed in the 2nd century BCE, reveal an uneasy truth. Romans understood the emotional complexity of power, yet accepted its injustice as inevitable. Love could exist, but only within the boundaries of ownership. The poet Ovid, in his Amores, romanticized the figure of the serva amica, the beloved slave girl, yet his verses treat her body as both muse and property, a possession to be praised and commanded. Public commerce mirrored private control. In the bustling markets of Rome, slaves were bought and sold like livestock. Notices advertised age, skills, and sexual appeal. In the brothels, lupanaria, many workers were enslaved. Their earnings belonged to their owners, not themselves. Archaeological remains from Pompeii show cubicles marked with carved names and graffiti, silent testimony to lives lived in perpetual exposure. Roman society called such places houses of Venus, sanctifying exploitation under the name of the goddess of love. The same culture that worshipped chastity in matrons glorified servitude in prostitutes, a moral economy sustained by contradiction. The sexual commodification of the enslaved body also intersected with medicine and superstition. Ancient physicians such as Galen and Serranus wrote of using slave women for anatomical observation, believing their suffering to be acceptable material for science. Enslaved bodies became laboratories of both desire and knowledge. Even magic drew upon their subjugation. Love spells preserved on papyri sometimes called for the hair or bodily fluids of slaves, whose lack of agency made them instruments of divine compulsion. In Rome, even the unseen world obeyed the hierarchy of flesh. Yet there were cracks in this edifice of power. The Stoic philosophers, particularly Epictetus, himself a former slave, redefined freedom as an internal state. "No man is free who is a slave to his passions," he declared. Though he spoke metaphorically, his words resonated in a world that equated mastery of others with mastery of self. Some masters freed their concubines, granting them partial citizenship as libertinae, and in rare cases, affection transcended ownership. Inscriptions from tombs reveal bonds of genuine love, a freedwoman dedicating a grave to her former master, or a husband to his wife, once my slave, now my equal. These epitaphs whisper a fragile humanity beneath the machinery of power. Still, Rome moralists rarely questioned the structure itself. To them, inequality was natural, even divine. The gods had arranged humanity in ranks, just as Jupiter ruled Olympus. The economy of desire followed the same logic as the economy of empire: conquest, possession, and control. The same soldiers who subdued Gaul and Africa filled Rome's slave markets with bodies. The same senators who debated virtue reclined on couches served by the conquered. Power, in its most intimate form, was the empire true religion. When Christianity began to spread through the empire, its vision of universal human dignity quietly undermined these assumptions. Early Christian writers like Paul and Lactantius proclaimed that in Christ there is neither slave nor free. Yet even as they preached equality of the soul, the social order endured. Roman law persisted in defining the enslaved body as property until the empire's final centuries. The paradox was unresolved. An empire that conquered the world could not free itself from the idea that pleasure was possession, and that the right to rule included the right to consume. To look back upon this system is to confront a civilization both magnificent and monstrous, capable of beauty, philosophy, and art, yet rooted in exploitation so intimate it became invisible. The Roman household, like the empire itself, was an engine of domination powered by flesh. Every feast, every law, every whispered rumor of love rested upon a foundation of unfreedom. The marble of Rome palaces gleamed because countless hands, unthanked and unseen, polished it. And behind every image of desire lay a truth Rome never denied, that power, when absolute, consumes even the human heart. The lives of women unfolded within an architecture of paradox. They were exalted as symbols of virtue, yet denied the independence to define it, entrusted with preserving family honor, yet excluded from political power, celebrated as mothers of heroes, yet blamed for the empire moral decay. To be a Roman woman was to walk a narrow path between reverence and restriction, where every gesture carried moral weight and every whisper could become scandal. In the Roman imagination, women were both the guardians of morality and its greatest threat. The ideal Roman woman was embodied in the figure of the matrona, chaste, dignified, obedient and loyal to her husband. The historian Livy memorialized early heroines like Lucretia, whose rape and suicide in 509 BCE became the moral foundation of the Republic itself. Lucretia's death was not simply personal tragedy, but political myth. Her violation symbolized the tyranny of kingship, and her purity restored through self-destruction became Rome's moral charter. From that story forward, Roman virtue was imagined in the image of violated chastity, avenged by discipline. It was a dangerous model, demanding perfection, punishing the human. Roman law institutionalized these expectations. Under the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis, introduced by Augustus in 18 BCE, adultery was criminalized as a public offense. Husbands were expected to report unfaithful wives. Fathers could even kill adulterous daughters caught in the act. Meanwhile, husband infidelities were tolerated as long as they involved women of lower status, slaves, prostitutes, or concubines. The law did not seek moral equality, but moral order, the preservation of lineage, and the assurance that a man's heirs were his own. As Tacitus dryly remarked, in their wives the Romans prized chastity, in themselves liberty. Yet within these constraints, Roman women found spaces of influence, quiet, strategic, often invisible. Marriage itself, though legally a transfer of guardianship, manus, could also become a partnership. The philosopher Seneca, writing to his mother Helvia, praised her learning and fortitude, reminding readers that intellect was not male property. Wealthy women managed estates, sponsored temples, and commissioned art. Through patronage and social diplomacy, they exercised what the Romans called auctoritas, a moral authority that could sway even senators. The Empress Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, was the model of this power. Outwardly modest, inwardly formidable, ancient gossip credited her with orchestrating imperial succession. Official inscriptions called her Mother of the Nation. For every Livia, there was a Messalina, a name that became synonymous with scandal. Wife of Emperor Claudius, Messalina's story has survived almost entirely through the pens of male moralists. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, each shaping her into an emblem of unrestrained female lust. Tacitus claimed she secretly married her lover Gaius Silius, while still married to Claudius, turning her into a symbol of chaos within the imperial household. Whether true or political fiction, the narrative served a clear function: to dramatize the threat of female autonomy. Messalina was punished not merely for adultery, but for stepping beyond the boundaries of subordination. Her death, ordered by her husband after the alleged mock wedding, became a ritual reaffirmation of patriarchal order. To Rome, a disobedient wife was a cosmic anomaly. Not all defiance took such spectacular form. Some women subverted expectations through intellect and wit. Clodia Metelli, sister of the demagogue Clodius Pulcher and muse or tormentor of the poet Catullus, scandalized her peers with her independence. Educated, wealthy, and politically active, she hosted salons where literature and politics mingled, a rare space where women spoke freely. Cicero, her bitter enemy, immortalized her in the Pro Caelio as a dangerous seductress, accusing her of corrupting young men and embodying moral decay. Yet the venom of his attack reveals the deeper anxiety she provoked, a woman who refused silence. Other women wielded influence through virtue rather than defiance. The matron Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, became the moral icon of the Republic. Widowed young, she devoted herself to raising her sons, whom she called her jewels. Her letters, fragments of which survive, reveal a mind both cultivated and shrewd. Later generations idealized her as Mater Patriae, the mother of the fatherland. In her chastity and eloquence, Cornelia represented the Roman fantasy of perfect womanhood, intelligent yet restrained, moral yet loyal to male authority. She was what Messalina was not, the woman whose virtue served the state, not herself. Sexuality for Roman women existed in a tangle of expectation and danger. Chastity, pudicitia, was celebrated as divine virtue, personified in statues and cults. The goddess Pudicitia had her own shrines, one for the patrician class, another for the plebeian, signifying both exclusivity and aspiration. But chastity was not merely abstinence, it was performance. A woman's dress, speech, and behavior all signaled her moral standing. The veil, the stola, long gown, and the modest eyes cast downward were marks of respectability. To deviate was to invite suspicion. As Ovid cynically advised in his Ars Amatoria, even virtue, if too visible, may offend. At the same time, Roman society was fascinated by female desire. In art and literature, women appeared as both temptress and teacher. Erotic frescoes from Pompeii show women not as passive figures, but as participants, even initiators, of pleasure. Love poetry, from Ovid to Propertius, celebrated mistresses who commanded emotional and physical surrender. The poet beloved was often fictional, yet she reflected real social anxieties. Women who read, wrote, and chose their lovers upset the Roman order. The tension between public morality and private longing animated the culture imagination. The same city that deified Pudicitia also worshipped Venus, goddess of love, beauty, and sensual freedom. Education was another arena of quiet revolution. By the late Republic, elite women studied rhetoric, philosophy, and Greek literature. They wrote letters, composed poetry, and engaged in intellectual debate. Sulpicia, the niece of the poet Messala Corvinus, left behind a handful of love poems remarkable for their honesty. In one she writes, "Love has come upon me, not hidden, but open. Let all know." Her candor defied the code of female silence. To later moralists, such openness was indecency. To modern historians, it is courage. Sulpicia stands as a rare Roman voice speaking without permission. The contradictions of Roman womanhood culminated in the imperial age, when empresses blurred the boundary between matron and monarch. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, navigated power with lethal skill. Coins minted in her honor show her face beside her son, an act of unprecedented parity. When Nero later ordered her death, Tacitus recorded her final words, "Smite my womb, for it bore such a monster." Her defiance at the moment of death was a final assertion of agency. Even destroyed, she controlled the narrative. In the end, Roman women existed within a moral labyrinth, praised for virtue, condemned for visibility, silenced yet indispensable. Their influence was measured not in decrees or laws, but in the subtle art of survival. The matrona, the courtesan, the poet, the empress, all navigated a society that defined them as symbols before it saw them as people. They lived within contradictions so powerful that they outlasted Rome itself. Even centuries later, Christian moralists and Renaissance scholars would invoke them, Cornelia as saintly mother, Messalina as warning, Clodia as cautionary tale. The empire laws crumbled, but its myths of womanhood endured. To study them is to see Rome heart exposed, a civilization obsessed with control, yet haunted by those who refused it. In their virtue and their rebellion, Roman women revealed the limits of a world built on male authority. Their lives, half remembered, half imagined, speak not only of constraint, but of the unyielding human will to exist beyond it. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire had conquered much of the known world, but its greatest conquest was of itself. The age of marble and indulgence began to crumble under the weight of its contradictions. Temples that once echoed with hymns to Venus stood empty, while new communities gathered in secret to break bread in the name of a crucified carpenter. In this twilight of the old gods, the language of desire was rewritten. What had once been ritual and pleasure became sin and temptation, and at the heart of this transformation stood a new vision of humanity, one in which the soul, not the body, was the measure of worth. Early Christians did not invent moral critique of Rome's sexual culture, they inherited it. Roman Stoics like Seneca and Musonius Rufus had already denounced lust as weakness and self-indulgence as decay. But Christianity went further. It moralized desire itself, not merely its excess. Where the Romans saw discipline as a civic virtue, Christians redefined it as a spiritual calling. The empire's sexual excesses became proof of its moral decline, a civilization consumed by its own appetites. In the words of Tertullian, a fiery theologian of the 2nd century, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? His questions symbolize the new divide between the wisdom of the flesh and the wisdom of the soul. The conversion of the empire imagination did not happen overnight. In the first centuries of the faith, Christian apologists faced ridicule from Roman elites who viewed their asceticism as absurd. Celsus, a pagan philosopher, mocked Christians for rejecting banquets, theatre, and sensual pleasure, accusing them of superstition and hatred of life. Yet to the Christian mind, this renunciation was liberation. The world indulgence was bondage, self-control was freedom. Clement of Alexandria described pagan feasts as funerals of the soul, where the body became both coffin and corpse. Against the Roman cult of pleasure, the Christians offered a vision of transcendence through restraint. This spiritual revolution had profound social implications. The early church elevated virginity and celibacy to ideals higher than marriage. For centuries, the Roman matrona had been defined by her fertility, her worth tied to producing heirs. Now, chastity became the mark of sanctity. Women who renounced marriage were no longer outcasts, but saints. Figures like Thecla, a legendary follower of Paul, defied family and state to preserve her virginity for God. Her story spread across the empire, inspiring women to flee arranged marriages and join Christian communities where purity was power. In rejecting the Roman household, they rejected its hierarchies. Male ascetics, too, became symbols of a new moral order. The Desert Fathers, Anthony, Pachomius, and others, retreated from the cities into the wilderness, seeking to conquer desire through solitude. Their lives inverted Roman ideals. Instead of mastering others, they sought mastery over themselves. Temptation was recast as spiritual warfare, the body as battlefield. In their writings, lust was no longer a private vice, but a cosmic force, the whisper of the devil himself. The pleasures that once adorned villas and banquets were now seen as snares of damnation. Flesh, once celebrated as divine vitality, became a symbol of frailty. As Christianity gained influence, this moral narrative fused with politics. When Emperor Constantine converted in the early 4th century, he inherited not only the empire armies, but its conscience. His reign marked a turning point. The old gods were tolerated but fading, their temples slowly transformed into churches. The imperial moral code began to reflect Christian values. Constantine banned certain public spectacles, restricted infanticide, and granted legal privileges to celibate clergy. What had once been civic virtue, loyalty to family and fertility, was now overshadowed by spiritual virtue, purity, humility, restraint. The rhetoric of moral decline became central to Christian interpretation of history. To writers like Lactantius and Eusebius, Rome's decadence was both punishment and prophecy. They portrayed the empire fall not as political failure, but as divine judgment for its lusts. "The world has grown old," wrote Lactantius. "Vice has become its habit, and the body of mankind decays like flesh long dead." This image, Rome as a rotting corpse, became a moral metaphor that haunted Western thought. Pagan orgies, temple prostitutes, and imperial debauchery were recast as symptoms of a dying civilization. The Christian world would inherit not Rome's sensuality, but its memory as sin. Yet the transition was not as absolute as it seemed. Christianity did not destroy the Roman world, it absorbed it. The new faith adopted imperial structures, rituals, and even language. The same basilicas that once honored emperors became cathedrals for saints. The title Pontifex Maximus, once borne by Caesar, passed to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. The transformation of erotic Rome into moral Christendom was less conquest than conversion. Pagan symbols of fertility found new meanings. The vine became Eucharistic, the fish a sign of faith. Even Venus, the goddess of love, was reborn in the image of Mary, Mother of God. Purity, transfiguring beauty. It was Augustine of Hippo who gave this moral vision its enduring form. Writing in the early 5th century, as barbarians approached the gates of Rome, Augustine argued in The City of God that the empire collapse was not the fault of Christianity, but the consequence of sin. For him, desire, concupiscentia, was the wound of original sin, proof of humanity's fall from grace. The sexual act, even within marriage, carried the memory of disobedience. In a single stroke, he transformed centuries of Roman pleasure into theology. The empire erotic vitality was reinterpreted as the evidence of its spiritual ruin. The body rebels against the soul, Augustine wrote, because the soul first rebelled against God. Through Augustine, Rome's moral narrative became universal. The body was no longer a vessel of divine energy, but a site of divine testing. Chastity was victory, indulgence, defeat. Yet the Church could not entirely sever its ties to the world it condemned. The same Rome that built brothels also built basilicas. The same art that adorned villas would later decorate cathedrals. The frescoes of Pompeii faded, but their spirit lingered in medieval temptation scenes where saints resisted the very pleasures their ancestors had celebrated. The Christian West inherited Rome guilt as much as its glory. The moral collapse of Rome, then, was not purely historical, it was ideological. It allowed later generations to draw a straight line from decadence to downfall, from pleasure to punishment. Historians like Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, would echo this theme, arguing that Christianity asceticism hastened the empire demise. But modern scholarship reveals a more complex truth. Rome's sensual culture did not destroy it. Rather, its reinterpretation gave birth to a new moral world. The fall of Rome was, in a sense, the rise of conscience. By the late 5th century, the empire that had once worshipped Venus now bowed before the Virgin. The statues of Priapus lay buried beneath basilicas, but the fascination with sin and purity endured. The Romans had turned desire into spectacle. The Christians turned it into confession. Both understood its power, one to celebrate, the other to fear. And in that fear, a new civilization was born. When the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE, the event seemed to mark an end, the death of empire, the triumph of faith, the collapse of decadence. Yet Rome did not vanish, it transmuted. Its roads still carried pilgrims, its aqueducts still fed cities, its language became the grammar of prayer, and beneath the cathedrals and cloisters that rose upon its ruins, the old rhythms of power, pleasure, and moral tension continued to beat, quietly but persistently. The Roman body, disciplined yet desiring, chaste yet indulgent, lived on in the soul of the West. For centuries after its fall, Rome became the cautionary mirror of civilization. To medieval chroniclers, it was the empire that drowned in its own luxury. To Renaissance humanists, the height of refinement lost too soon. Each age saw what it needed to see. The Christian Middle Ages inherited the Roman imagination of the body, but inverted its values. Where marble once celebrated sensual form, the cloister sought to erase it. Yet even in denial, Rome endured. Monastic vows of chastity echoed stoic self-control. Saints' temptations in desert visions recalled the feasts of Bacchus, only now as battles for the soul. The Latin word virtus, once meaning manly vigor, became virtue in the moral sense, discipline sanctified. The church vision of sin was inseparable from Rome memory. Augustine theology, born in the Empire's final century, shaped how medieval Europe understood desire as both divine spark and human peril. The body, once public instrument of pleasure, became private battlefield of conscience. Confession replaced performance, penance replaced display. The sensual imagery that adorned Roman villas found new expression in frescoes of temptation and martyrdom. Pain became purity, suffering became beauty. The Roman passion for spectacle did not die, it changed its audience. The amphitheater became the cathedral, the crowd roar became the chant of monks. Both sought transcendence through the drama of the body, yet the fascination with Rome's sensual world never disappeared. During the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered Ovid, Lucretius, and Petronius. Artists carved Venus anew in marble, painted her face in the likeness of courtesans, and crowned her with Christian grace. The pagan body returned, not as scandal, but as ideal. Michelangelo David, though biblical in name, was Roman in form, the perfect fusion of discipline and desire. The rediscovery of Rome, erotic art in excavations of Pompeii during the 18th century, shocked and thrilled Europe, forcing modern moralists to confront a world where pleasure was sacred, not sinful. Cabinets of erotica, hidden in Naples and the Vatican alike, testified to a continuing ambivalence, admiration wrapped in shame. The Enlightenment, too, could not escape Rome's shadow. Philosophers and historians turned its decadence into moral allegory. Edward Gibbon, writing in 1776, saw the empire decline as the inevitable result of luxury and superstition, a warning to his own age. Yet his tone was tinged with admiration. He confessed that the grandeur of Rome ruins moved him more than the sermons of saints. Her genius, he wrote, still animates the world. Gibbon ambivalence captures the paradox that has haunted every modern encounter with Rome, the tension between moral judgment and aesthetic awe. In the 19th century, as archaeology unveiled more of Rome-buried cities, Artists and writers reimagined its sensuality. Painters like Lawrence Alma Tadema and poets like Swinburne revived visions of marble baths, golden feasts, and languid decadence, not as condemnations, but as elegies for lost vitality. The Victorian world, outwardly pious yet secretly fascinated by forbidden desire, saw in Rome a mirror of its own hypocrisies. Scholars debated whether the empire fell from moral corruption or from overreach, but in every version the body remained central. The disciplined soldier versus the indulgent patrician, the chaste matron versus the courtesan. Rome had become the Western conscience, its temptations externalized in history. Modern psychology would inherit the same imagery. Sigmund Freud, fascinated by antiquity, used Roman metaphors to describe the human mind. The psyche, he suggested, was like a city built in layers, its ruins and monuments coexisting, a buried Pompeii of desire. His concept of repression mirrored the Christianization of Rome passions. What was once celebrated as natural now returned as neurosis. In the Freudian imagination, the Roman feast became the unconscious, the theater of repressed instinct. Civilization, he argued, was built upon the renunciation of instinct, a thesis the Romans, with their obsession for control, would have understood all too well. Even today, Rome legacy shapes how the West speaks of morality and pleasure. The language of decadence remains Roman in spirit, linking indulgence with decline, sensuality with weakness. Modern debates about virtue and vice, liberation and restraint, echo the same dialectic that animated the ancient Forum. The dual inheritance of Venus and Mary still governs Western imagination. Beauty that tempts, purity that redeems. Our laws, our art, even our politics are haunted by the Roman fusion of power and desire. When modern leaders fall to scandal, commentators invoke the imagery of Nero and Caligula, as if every excess were a reenactment of Rome moral theatre. And yet there is another Rome, one less moralizing, more human. Archaeology and scholarship have revealed that beneath the propaganda of both pagan indulgence and Christian condemnation lay ordinary lives, families, lovers, artisans, freed slaves. In Pompeii graffiti, one reads not the language of decadence, but of affection. I love her who loves me. In epitaphs, one finds tenderness. To my husband, my light. These fragments remind us that Roman sexuality was not merely spectacle or sin, but the texture of life itself. The empire moral contradictions were not abstractions. They were lived realities, as complex as our own. Perhaps that is Rome's enduring lesson. Its people, so often reduced to archetypes, stoic fathers, corrupt emperors, wanton courtesans, were not caricatures of vice, but mirrors of humanity. They lived in a world where desire was both celebrated and feared, where power justified possession, where beauty was divine and dangerous. Their legacy is not simply one of moral failure or grandeur, but of continuity. Every age builds its own Rome. Moralists rebuild the empire of virtue, hedonists the empire of pleasure, artists the empire of form. The city ruins endure because they contain both, the yearning for order and the thrill of chaos. Standing today among those ruins, one can still sense the hum of that ancient contradiction. The marble columns, cracked but upright, speak of discipline. The frescoes, faded but vibrant, whisper of forbidden touch. In the same space where Vestal virgins once guarded sacred fire and Bacchic revelers danced under the moon, tourists now move in silence, half pilgrims, half voyeurs. They too are part of the story, inheritors of a world that taught humanity to see its own reflection in the struggle between restraint and release. Rome never truly died. It transformed into us. Its laws shape our justice, its language our speech, its myths our morality. We still wrestle with the same questions it asked in its marble halls and smoky taverns. What is virtue without freedom? What is freedom without restraint? The empire of flesh became the empire of faith, then of reason, but beneath each the same pulse endures. To study ancient Rome is to study ourselves, our fears, our longings, our endless attempt to reconcile the sacred and the sensual within the fragile temple of the human heart.